Well, it's good to have you with us here at Real Israel. We're bringing you the Real Israel on this YouTube channel, and we have a terrific feature here. It's our very first edition of What the Israeli Papers Say. And I'm delighted to say that joining us from Jerusalem are both Benjamin Weinthal and Judith Sudilovsky, who are both esteemed journalists in the region. Benjamin Weinthal is the European Affairs correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. He's also a research fellow at the US-based Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and has also been published in the likes of the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Haaretz, Fox News and elsewhere. He also contributes to German publications as well, including the Frankfurter Rundschau and the Berliner Morgen Post. Welcome, Benjamin. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
And also here, as you can see, Judith Sudilovsky, also working out of Jerusalem. She's a freelance journalist who has covered Israel and the Palestinian territories for over 25 years. She's a regular contributor to the Jerusalem Report international magazine, the 972 magazine, and she writes regular feature stories as well for the Catholic News Service. So thanks for joining us, Judith.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the thing about our What the Israeli Papers Say is that we're trying to put a spin on the Israeli news that you may not see in the more mainstream outlets, where sometimes you find that correspondents are parachuted in with only a passing knowledge, shall we say, of the actual events on the ground. And also, we're trying to give a very realistic spin. We're not here to serve up a rose-tinted vision of what's going on in Israel. And on the other side, we're not here to be Israel bashing either. We want to play it straight down the middle. And that's what we're looking to achieve with journalists from different sides of the political and news spectrum as well. So I want to start, first of all, guys, with the situation that everybody's having to live through at the moment, the coronavirus. And obviously, Israel of late has risen to the very top of the statistics as far as infections and fatalities go per capita. So it doesn't look like we're in the very best position at the moment. Benjamin, how do you think the government's handling things at the moment?
Well, I think the Israeli government handled the first wave well in the spring, as we know. We received, the Israeli government received, enormous praise according to different surveys and from other governments. But the problem was, in my view, the Israeli government, certain leaders, sent a wrong message to the population by not wearing masks, and that created a climate of relaxation, and that allowed, of course, a second wave, or contributed, I should say, to a second wave of the coronavirus to kick in. And that's why one factor is in the current lockdown is because of this lax reaction to the social distancing and mask wearing recommendations and well, not recommendations, actually, it was a government policy. So when you have a top-down style policy that's being violated by Israel's leaders, it does not bode well for curbing corona. And then, as we see today, based on the headlines in all the Israeli publications, the new virus has increased by 40% among the ultra-Orthodox population, Haredi population. And that's another problem within Israeli society in terms of the disconnect between secular society and the ultra-Orthodox population, and the need to overcome that disconnect.
Yeah, it is. It's a very big concern. Also, I saw today, Judith, that some 17 different flights that came in from, many of them from Ukraine, where many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews had been to special religious services at the grave of Rabbi Nachman of a Jewish New Year, came back with infections, and they're going back into the general population. It has to be a huge worry, this issue with the ultra-Orthodox communities.
Yes, I think it's a big concern. I agree with a lot of what Benjamin said. I think it was easier in the first wave because there really wasn't a government established yet. It was still a transitional government. So Prime Minister Netanyahu didn't have to really balance around with too many other politicians there at that time. I agree with him also that there's a concern that certain segments of the population, as we're seeing that within the Haredi and also Orthodox communities, they're less likely to listen to the requirements. They're listening more to the rabbis rather than to the politicians. And I think that a lot of the politicians are not brave enough to just put their foot down and say, you know, right now it's our law that rules, that, you know, we have to listen to this because this is the safety of the whole country. That has to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a view that most people are expressing here, a lot of frustration. But of course, we have to point out it's not just the ultra-Orthodox communities. There's many people also. We've seen parties being held on the beach in recent days and weeks, and other gatherings, which are very worrying. But it does seem that the greater amount of the infection relative to the population does seem to be with the ultra-Orthodox communities that tend to live in very close quarters, in very congested and crowded areas as well.
I did hear something interesting on the radio today concerning the Sukkot holiday coming up, whereas the Ashkenazi rabbis, leaders, mentioned that, you know, people should try to pray outside if they could. They didn't mention not praying inside the synagogue. While according to the radio report, the Sephardi community leaders, rabbis, did just say, you know, they should be prayer should be held only outside. So they did make that differentiation that there's, you know, some rabbis are looking at this in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's the mixed messaging across the board. And as Benjamin pointed out earlier, the early examples that were set at the very start, even in the first wave, with the Prime Minister, the President, and other ministers ignoring the own advice of the medical experts, didn't set on the best track. And well, we can only hope for the very best. I mean, it's not just us. I think everybody in the world, you know, they're beginning to despair of their governments, whether it's the US or Britain or anywhere else. It seems that no politicians have really got a grip on this, which is quite frightening, really. Well, we'll have to see what happens there. But I want to move on now because I want to talk about a couple of stories that our two journalist colleagues have highlighted for this episode of What the Israeli Papers Say. And I want to first turn to Benjamin Weinthal, who is an expert about the workings and all the shenanigans that Hezbollah has been causing in the region and even further around the world. Now, obviously, in recent weeks, we've seen a terrible incident at the port of Beirut with that dreadful explosion that caused such damage and death. And in recent days, there's also been reports of another likely source of a potential explosion in the future. Now, it's quite a complicated situation, but I think, Benjamin, you're able to shed a little bit of light on this particular subject.
Well, there was a explosion roughly, I think, 30 miles south of Beirut in Lebanon that involved what might have been a weapons depot. It's unclear, from the Iranian-backed Hezbollah movement that controls the Lebanese government de facto. So this explosion rocked this part of Lebanon. Of course, the Hezbollah militia in this area barred journalists from entering the scene, so we don't have a lot of on-the-ground reporting from that area. But as you mentioned, Paul, this comes roughly 2 months after the Beirut port explosion killed nearly 200 people and injured hundreds of others, and further decimated the Beirut economy. So it's a highly dangerous and volatile situation right now in Lebanon. because Hezbollah has all these precision-guided munitions around the country, especially in the south, that are aimed at Israel, and they have used ammonium nitrate, which can be used as a fertilizer ingredient, but also is frequently used as an explosive ingredient. It's sort of the explosive ingredient of choice for Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has been found to use this type of explosive in Europe and stored it where I'm usually based in Germany. In one state, Baden-Württemberg, they just released a report about Hezbollah storage of ammonium nitrate being transported out of the country in 2016. So you have this broad-based Hezbollah terrorist network that it's not only limited to Lebanon, but it's an international terrorist movement, and the international community, to use that phrase, if there is really an international community, has not managed to crack down on Hezbollah. For example, the European Union has refused to designate Hezbollah as a terrorist movement, the entire movement, whereas the U.S., Canada, the Arab League, Israel, of course, and many other countries have classified Hezbollah as a terrorist movement.
And Judith, I just wanted to ask you for your point of view on this from the view of the people of the region, because you do so much work reporting on Arab societies in Israel, and obviously there are many cross-border interests between Israel and Lebanon. Obviously, having Hezbollah there and all the issues they're causing is making life very difficult for many people in the southern Lebanon region, as well as greater Lebanon as well.
Yes, I think that the Lebanese are very tired. Also, they had a long civil war. They finally kind of got that settled down. There was the fighting with Israel. The Lebanese were with Israel in the southern Lebanon, and I think that they're just kind of wanting to have a normal life. A lot of I've spoken to Maronites, a lot of Maronites and Greek Orthodox Christians in northern Israel who have family in Lebanon, and it's a very difficult situation for them because they want to have their own government with their own people, and it's not easy. It's not easy. It's a very frustrating and sometimes scary situation.
Yeah, there's no doubt it is a very, very difficult situation, and the people of Lebanon are in a real sticky position. But I just want to go back to Benjamin Weinthal, because there's been so many reports of new weaponry entering the arena there via Iran to Hezbollah, and that has to be something that's of great concern, and you've been reporting about some of the new developments there.
Right. Well, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's disclosures during his address to the United Nations General Assembly was quite significant, because he identified a new Hezbollah site that lodges or holds precision-guided munitions, PGMs, which is a grave threat to the security of Israel. This new site is located in a Beirut neighborhood near a gas station, and it has the potential, according to the Israeli government, to create another significant explosion in the city. The problem I see with these, with Hezbollah's use of PGMs and housing PGMs in civilian areas, is it's a violation of international law and the U.S. law, because Hezbollah uses these neighborhoods and people as human shields. And Israel, of course, has experienced this war violation in the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, where Hamas stores weapons in civilian areas and uses human beings as civilian shields. And the U.S. has legislation to sanction entities that use human shields. The legislation was passed in 2018. So the U.S. government could, based on the disclosures that Prime Minister Netanyahu revealed, as well as the IDF over the last few days, We now know there are 3 sites the U.S. government could sanction those Hezbollah, as well as any parties involved in harboring those PGMs, and as part of a violation of the legislation, as well as European governments and the UN, because it's a violation of the Geneva Convention. I believe the 4th Geneva Convention stated that using human beings as a form of human shields during conflict is a violation of the Geneva Convention. The question is whether the international community has the political will to do that, and whether the United States government now will enforce its 2018 legislation against Hezbollah.
Well, it certainly is a very difficult situation that we see ourselves in here, because the United Nations really has proved so ineffective, either incapable or unwilling to enforce the policing of that area in South Lebanon where these missiles so proliferate. And I was actually in the very north of Israel just the other week, and I was looking over from the border fence to the direction of Nabatea in southern Lebanon, and that was there. As I was pointed out to me by a number of people that we were discussing the situation with, it's just north of Nabatea in the valley there in southern Lebanon, where many of the missiles were being launched during the times when missiles were fired from that region into central Israel. So there's a lot of weaponry in there that the UN is certainly aware of, but they don't seem to be doing very much about it. And that's not good for Israel, of course, but on an ongoing basis, it's no good and doing no favours at all to the people of Lebanon themselves, as we well know. I just want to move on though, because Judith, a very interesting story you produced and wrote for the Plus 972 website just recently, and that was about the proliferations of weapons in the Arab community in Israel and the amount of violence that is going on there, including a number of deaths, murders, some of them accidental, people caught in the crossfire. And it certainly is a situation that is of grave concern. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about that story that you produced just recently.
Yes, I think that it's important to point out that this is an issue that has a lot of different layers. You know, there's a lot of times it just comes up on the headlines, you know, another Arab man was killed, an Arab woman was killed, the teacher was killed in September, because of this proliferation of arms in the Arab Israeli community. But there's a reason for them being there. There has been since, I mean, maybe it's fitting to be talking about this now because this is the 20th anniversary of the October events, where there was a huge rift created. I mean, things weren't always that great beforehand between the Israeli Arab community here and the police, but that violent, those riots and the police reaction to them in October, where 2000, when 13 Israeli citizens were killed by the police, really created a big rift in the Israeli Arab community, where they saw that the police, it kind of like confirmed the Israeli police saw them as part of the enemy, and that created a total vote of non-confidence for the police. The police withdrew from the communities, and it created a kind of a vacuum there. A lot of the when the police booted out the organized crime within Jewish communities, they merely shifted over to the Israeli Arab communities where there were no police, and they created like a subculture over there where they served not only their own needs, their own criminal needs, but also kind of as contractors for the Jewish mobs. And so it creates a kind of a criminality within the Arab Israeli community that the police aren't stopping. They are weapons that are coming in also from the West Bank, but a lot of them are weapons coming in from the IDF and from the police, which haven't been stopped. You know, if the police try to the police have proven themselves capable of getting weapons from.
Well, Judith, I just want to cut in there and just for clarification purposes make it clear that the weapons that have reached these elements from the IDF and the police, they're weapons that have been stolen, of course. They're not weapons that have been handed by the IDF and the police to these organisations, because there has been a huge instance of weapons being stolen from within army bases and police stations. So that's just a situation that is very worrying. But just for clarification, they're not handed out. They're weapons that have been looted from those two particular sources.
Yeah, here. And so these weapons are there. There were two campaigns to by the police, as giving residents the ability to theoretically anonymously give their weapons in, but they were not very successful at all, because a lot of the places where they could be turned in were not anonymous, so people didn't want to go there. And they didn't last very long. They only lasted for a few days, for 10 days, 2 weeks, and it takes longer than that to get people to turn in their weapons. There's a feeling of fear among the citizens, the residents of Arab communities. They see the police there mostly, unfortunately, not as maintaining law and order, but as enforcement for, let's say, house demolitions, because of the house demolitions, and the police are there supporting, providing the security for the demolitions of homes, which the homes are being demolished because they were built illegally, but they were built illegally because they are not able to get building permits, because their master plans for the town, many master plans, a lot of the master plans haven't been approved. So there's this whole lack of confidence. They see.
No, it certainly seems that there is a disconnect between the authorities and a decent proportion of the Arab community. I just want to turn to Benjamin for his view on this as regards the fact that there is such a high incidence of violent gun crime in the Arab communities. Do you have any insight into why that might be a particular factor?
From a journalistic point of view, I would hope there would be more coverage of the topic. I'm not sure it's as it's been widely reported as I would like it to be, especially for folks outside of Israel. It's a topic that I think has largely been more of a internal Israel news story. Judith probably, I would imagine, can discuss whether it's reached international headlines or not headlines, but international coverage.
I don't think that there's been, like Benjamin said, there has not been enough in-depth coverage of this issue, because it requires a lot more digging than just writing about another shooting, because there's a lot more involved in this story than just a crime or a shooting, because a lot of these tensions that are created within the community are because of a lot of there's lack of land to build on. So because there's no permits to build, so then families and people fight over this land, and that becomes the target of criminal activity. When there has been efforts by the police and people like the Abraham's Initiative to better connect the communities, to better understand the communities, but still, when you have money coming into an Arab community, into the let's say the municipality, and they're able to give out jobs, they become a target. The mayors become a target of the crimes themselves. There's now 10 mayors of 10 Arab communities who their lives are under threat by criminal elements, because they have that's where the jobs are. Now, the police does have the power and the knowledge and the ability to get to different corners of places when they want to. And so this is what a lot of the residents and Arab politicians are saying, is that as long as this crime happens within the Arab communities, the police aren't paying attention to them anymore. I did speak to police spokesmen, And we talked about a program with Abraham Initiatives, where there's more connection within the community. They're hiring more Arab policemen, including women, Arab policemen, to be able to talk also to women victims of violence, because the violence that makes the headlines are the murders, but there's a lot of other violent incidents going on there that needs to be addressed. And in order for the violence to be addressed, the social issues need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, it certainly is a multi-layered issue, and of course very challenging for the Arab community and for the Israeli police, who have got a lot on their plate. I know that in my reporting I've done in past years to do with the Israeli mafia, the Israeli police have not always been able to cope with the challenges that poses. The mafia crossing all sections of Israeli society, from the Russian elements, the religious elements, the Arab side of the mafia as well as other mafia groups from the Caucasus, Russian Caucasus, and all sorts of other organisations, and across all the religious groups as well. So there's a lot really that the Israeli police has to deal with, but of course difficult times for everybody everywhere, but the Arab community with a big problem there with this proliferation of weapons. And we need to remember that 1 in 5 Israeli citizens is Arab, so what happens to them really does matter to Israel as a whole. But I want to move on. But just on a lighter note, for our final story, it was reported today in the Times of Israel that Borat is back. Yes, Sacha Baron Cohen is coming back with another edition of the Borat movies, and of course he's going to cause havoc and mayhem wherever he goes. It's a character that's been very much beloved here in Israel because of his outrageous nature, but also because he speaks his foreign language, which is meant to be Kazakhstani. It's actually Hebrew that he's speaking, so that certainly interests us here in Israel. But I just wondered, Benjamin Weinthal, I know that you're a film buff. Is Borat, the new movie, something that you'd pay to see?
I would pay to see the Act 2 of Borat. I find Sacha Baron Cohen to be an enormously talented actor. I enjoyed him in the Netflix series The Spy, and I have fond memories of the first Borat. So excuse me. So there's no shortage of humor when it comes to Sacha Baron Cohen. And right now, I think we need to breathe a lot of humor and life into our lives because of the lockdown here in Israel, and hopefully after the lockdown, at some point I'll be able to make it into a movie theater to see him once the theaters reopen.
Well, I certainly hope so. What about you, Judith? Does he offend your sensibilities, or is Sacha Baron Cohen and his Borat character something that you can really sit back and enjoy as well?
I think he's rude and crude and irreverent, and I laughed hysterically through Borat. My 2 teenage sons love him. It's one of their most perhaps favorite movies. They're constantly quoting it. They love that a lot of the language is in Hebrew. So yeah, even he's kind of like, I love to hate him. He you say, oh my God, is he really doing that? And then, but you can't help but laugh.
No, he really does make you cringe. Actually, I was just reading in the report that it says that the former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani is set to report Baron Cohen to the police in July because he copies for an interview wearing a bikini. That's Baron Cohen, not Giuliani, wearing the bikini, by the way, just for clarification. But listen, we're just about running out of time for today. So for this first edition of the Israeli What Papers Say, I want to thank very much both Benjamin Weinthal and Judith Sudilovsky, and I hope very much we'll be hearing more from you in future editions of the newspaper. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. It's been a pleasure.